Welcome, everyone. I can see the participants joining slowly, so we will give folks a few minutes to get logged in. But welcome to an Office of Equity Lunch and Learn. We are so excited to have you today. Really great to see all these numbers coming in. We have an amazing presentation today, and we couldn't be more thrilled with the guests that we are bringing to you all. So we will just give folks just a couple more seconds to get logged in. I can see all the numbers just jumping as we've opened up. Looking really great. So welcome everyone. As folks log in, the virtual world of Lunch and Learn, you should see a Q&A box as well as a chat box. Both are open to all attendees. Perfect. Closed captioning is also available. So if you want to click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, that will allow you to be able to see the closed captioning option. That is an optional feature for you all. You can sort of turn it on and off per your interest. So we're going to give folks just a couple more seconds. I see we're at 93 participants right now. We're super, super excited to have you. Thank you everyone for joining us on your lunch break. Our presenters are at the 10 a.m. time zone, and here in San Antonio, we are at the noon hour. Please feel free to have your lunch while we have this really, really exciting presentation. So I see the participants numbers have slowed just a little bit, so I will kick us off officially. So welcome everyone to the Office of Equity's Lunch and Learn with PolicyLink. I'm Dan Gibbs. I'm the Chief Equity Officer for the City of San Antonio's Office of Equity. I'm joined by two of my other colleagues today, Jonathan Malagon and Amanda Ireta. We also have two other equity managers in our office. Many of you know, Amy Casso and Jonathan Butler. We could not be more excited today to offer this Lunch and Learn. It is open to all city employees, anybody who wanted to join us today to learn about a phenomenal tool that's called the National Equity Atlas. And this is a tool that I have been a super fan of for many years and have seen various presentations by PolicyLink around the Equity Atlas and what it is and how do we use it and what new data comes online. It's been a fantastic tool when looking at disparities, both nationally but also locally. So we wanted to bring PolicyLink to share some expertise around what this tool is, what it does, and how you can use it in your city departments to help advance equity in the work that you're doing. We also referenced the National Equity Atlas in our budget equity tool. So many of you have been a part of budgeting for equity in your departments, or you may have seen the tool. The tool is available on our website. So if you haven't taken a look at our budgeting for equity tool, absolutely download it, take a look. Feel free to email us anytime if you have questions about the budget equity tool. So the reason that we really wanted to do this presentation about the National Equity Atlas is because we want to close the gaps so that race and income no longer predict anyone's success, both locally and nationally. What we see today are huge disparities across all demographic spectrums that really identify the need for us to prioritize specific services, specific ways of doing programmatic delivery that centers disparities and centers an outcomes-driven approach to closing those disparities. So kind of step one is understanding them and being able to visualize what are all these gaps. So PolicyLink has developed a phenomenal tool, which Abby will tell you more about, that can really help you visualize some of these gaps in multiple different ways. So with that, I'm super excited to hand it over to PolicyLink for our Lunch and Learn on the National Equity Atlas.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us today. My name is Abby Langston, she, her, and I am a senior associate here at PolicyLink. If you're not familiar with our work, we are a national research and action institute headquartered in Oakland, California, but we work with communities all across the country to advance racial and economic equity by lifting up what works. And we say lifting up what works because our work is really guided by the conviction that local leaders are national leaders, that the solutions that are going to help us to really advance racial equity and build a more equitable nation are happening in communities, in cities, at the grassroots. And so we really work to connect with and help to scale up the solutions and the local wisdom of communities across the country. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. I have a couple of my colleagues joining as well, Michelle Huang and Selena Tan. You may or may not see them, but they will be with us in the chat and in the Q&A. And so really appreciate their support as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk you through the National Equity Atlas. I want to invite you to submit any questions that you have or thoughts that come up. The chat is open, the Q&A is also open, and this tool is designed to be interactive and user-friendly. So please feel free at any time if you have questions. I want to make this a conversation. So we'll love to hear what you're thinking about this as we go through. So a little bit about the National Equity Atlas before we get started. It is born out of a partnership between PolicyLink and the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. Our two organizations have been working together for well over a decade and really recognized a gap in the field, in the capacity that equity campaign leaders and local organizations and local governments had in terms of access to disaggregated data. We know that it's a really important cornerstone of developing strong equity solutions, not only of sort of measuring the inequities that Sam was talking about and understanding the scope and scale of our challenges, not only to track the progress that we're making over time, but also to help identify the priority areas and priority populations as we're trying to develop solutions. So really understanding how to integrate that disaggregated data across the kind of life timeline of developing equity policies and equity strategies is really important. And it's a way that we try to contribute to the field and building the equity movement as a whole. And we do that in a few different ways. First, we conduct our own signature research. We partner with organizations across the country to kind of identify areas where our data and policy insights can be really helpful in moving the work forward. We equip equity campaigns with tailored data. So, we have worked with national coalitions around who are doing work around tenants' rights advocacy and housing insecurity or economic justice to provide kind of tailored data insights for their work. And then we produce and maintain the National Equity Atlas, this online data tool that is really kind of our flagship. And its purpose is to democratize access to data. We know that asymmetries in that access reflect asymmetries in power. And so ensuring that the folks who are working to build a more equitable nation have access to just as much data and information as everyone else is really important to us. And so we built this tool, launched it in 2014 to provide data on the US as a whole, all 50 states, the 150 largest metro regions, and the 100 largest cities. And so there are a couple of unique contributions that we make. One is having data available at the city level. There are lots of tools out there that provide state and metro level data, and we're not trying to compete or reproduce what they're doing, but we also know that there are a lot of things that happen within core cities in the context of a regional economy that can be really important. And the other is the level of data disaggregation that we make possible. So looking at outcomes not only by race and ethnicity, but also gender and nativity and age, economic security status, ancestry, right? So even digging in more deeply than the sort of major racial ethnic groups to understand how different populations are experiencing different outcomes. So that's kind of the highest level overview of what this is. We're going to dig in, see what data we have available for San Antonio, how you can use the tool in your work. And before we do that, I am going to ask Jen to launch our poll. It's a very easy pop quiz, 2 questions, no wrong answers, just so that I can kind of get a sense of where you all are in terms of your familiarity with the Atlas and sort of your use of data currently. So I'll give everyone just a minute or 2 to answer these questions. Oh, and I see there's a question in the chat. I'll just answer this quickly. What you're seeing here is a video on the Atlas homepage that I'm actually going to show you in just a minute. So if you're worried that you were seeing a repetition of the same 2 pictures, that's supposed to be happening. And Jen, maybe once we get to, I don't know, 50% response, we can go ahead and show the results of the poll. Okay, great. So a handful of folks here have some familiarity with the Atlas. Hopefully you will also learn something new today about our features and how you can use it. And everyone else is new, which is super exciting for me because I think it's a fantastic tool. I'm excited to share it with you. And it looks like most of you use disaggregated data in your work at least sometimes, which is great. I am imagining that many of you could or are interested in learning how to, and so we can talk a little bit about that today as well. All right, so before, you know what, I need to reshare my screen. Sorry about that. There we go. So before we dive into the tool, I do want to just show you this quick introductory video that we made that talks a little bit about how we do our work and what it is, because it's more succinct than I would probably be, and then we'll dig in.
Racial equity is the key to economic prosperity for the nation and for our communities. And local data that is broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, and nativity.
I'm going to try this one more time, friends.
Racial equity is the key to economic prosperity for the nation and for our communities. And local data that is broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, and nativity is critical to developing equity solutions. So that's where the National Equity Atlas comes in, which was produced by PolicyLink and the USC Equity Research Institute. The Atlas is America's most detailed report card on racial and economic equity. We democratize equity data, equipping community organizers, advocates, and policymakers with powerful indicators, charts, maps, and policy ideas to fuel equity campaigns and policy initiatives. So for example, efforts like the Ensuring Opportunity campaign to end poverty and California's Contra Costa County.
I'm the policy manager of Ensuring Opportunity. We work across sectors to end poverty in Contra Costa County. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare many inequities. Everything people had worked so hard for was in jeopardy for no fault of their own. Equity Atlas data has been an invaluable asset to understand how our Black, Latinx, and immigrant communities were disproportionately at a much higher risk of eviction. With other advocacy groups, we created a fact sheet that we used to mobilize organizations and residents for common sense tenant protections. It also helped our elected officials understand what communities of color were going through and inform their emerging racial equity agendas. Through our advocacy and with the data in hand, we were able to successfully pass and extend a county-wide eviction moratorium, secure funding for tenant legal services, and install protections against rent increases and late fees.
The National Equity Atlas is taking our campaign support to the next level with the launch of the Racial Equity Data Lab. The Racial Equity Data Lab is a new space on the National Equity Atlas where you can create your own data dashboards, maps, and visualizations and tell your community's equity story using Atlas data. Right now, you can go to the lab and get started by creating a $15 an hour data visual to support efforts to raise the minimum wage and advance racial and gender equity in your community. Learn more at www.nationalequityatlas.org/lab.
All right, so when you visit the Atlas homepage, which is nationalequityatlas.org, you will see the sort of intro video that we just watched, and then a kind of high-level overview of our work. There is our indicators database, the data tool, which is where we're going to spend most of our time today. There is the archive of our research, including the fact sheets that you saw mentioned in the video, as well as the kind of equity profiles that we have done for different regions, the reports that we've done on different issues related to housing and economic justice, the racial generation gap, all of the kind of research that we've done as a team, and then sort of our latest analyses and projects. All of our work is structured around a sort of three-part framing that you can see here. Number one, racism is an urgent challenge, right? We know that achieving equity is going to require bold solutions that are driven by data and informed by the voice and wisdom of local communities, and that even as our demographics are changing, see that the face of America is changing, these inequities threaten our economic prosperity. So achieving racial equity is not just a moral imperative, it's also an economic imperative. We say that equity is the key to prosperity, or equity is the superior growth model, because we have calculated that the nation's GDP would actually be about $2.7 trillion stronger if there were no racial gaps in income. So if we were able to close the disparities to achieve racial equity in both employment and wages, everyone would benefit. So it kind of means that equity is everybody's job. So this is sort of the way that we talk about these issues. It's the way that we set up our data tool, because we know that data is important, but it's not the only way to know things. And so you have to have a strong narrative. You want to be using data to tell a particular story. So this is the story that we want to tell about why equity matters and how much for our communities. Now within our indicators, which you can access at the top menu here, or check out this landing page to kind of understand the different categories, we have basically 5 buckets of indicators. The first is around demographics, to understand the nature and extent of demographic change in your place, whether that's your city or your state, or looking at the nation as a whole. We know that in one generation's time, the US is no longer going to have a single racial ethnic majority. Will be a majority of people of color nation by 2044. And so the urgency of equity is now, right? This is no longer sort of a far off future. When we think about the babies being born today, the majority of children under the age of 5 are already people of color. The majority of the young workforce in just a few years will be people of color. So understanding how those dynamics are playing out differently in different places is a really important piece of the story here. Then you can see that the kind of largest group of indicators we have are what we call economic vitality. So really understanding how people are able to connect to the economy, to the opportunities that are being created, what kinds of jobs are growing, how are productivity gains being distributed, what does income inequality look like? So when we think about things, the pressing challenges that are sort of coming to the forefront of our national discourse again around the racial wealth gap and around access to opportunities, we have a whole range of ways to dig into that. But we also know that maintaining a really strong focus on people and centering people in our analysis is important. And so we have a group of indicators around readiness. These, you could think of these as sort of the human capital indicators, looking at whether or not people are being served by our systems and institutions to be prepared to participate and prosper in their community. And we also know that place matters. We do a lot of place-based work. We know that the context in which people are living and navigating the labor market and navigating different policy environments is obviously a really important factor. So we want to look at connectedness, the indicators of sort of the geography of opportunity and how well people are able to take advantage of different opportunities and resources where they live. So looking at things like housing and transportation and neighborhood quality. And then finally, we have a couple of really unique analyses that we've designed to try to quantify the economic benefits of equity. So as I mentioned, part of our framing is that equity is a superior growth model. And we come to that conclusion based on our analysis of the increased GDP from closing racial gaps in income and the sort of increased spending that people would have available if they weren't burdened by rent that's too high, right? So we look at the economic benefits of eliminating rent burden and the economic benefits of racial equity in income. So what I want to do for the next maybe 30 minutes or so is walk you through a few of these indicators. We'll look at San Antonio. I want to make sure you understand all the different features that are available, all of the different ways that you can access and cut and use this data, and then make sure that we have plenty of time for questions and discussion afterward. So I'm going to start with race ethnicity. And you'll notice I was already looking in the atlas this morning, so it's going to make me choose my city again. But you'll notice that the first thing you can do when you choose your indicator group and indicator is then to select a geography type. Today, we're just going to be looking at the city of San Antonio. So you select city, and then we'll scroll down here to San Antonio. And this chart is the main data display here shows you over time the kind of racial and ethnic composition of the population of San Antonio. So we can see that, I mentioned that it will be 2044 before the United States as a whole has a people of color majority. San Antonio has clearly had that already for quite some time. In 1980, 62% of the population was people of color. By 2017, it's 75%. And one thing to note here that I think is particularly important in a city like yours is that we use mutually exclusive categories for race and ethnicity. So when we use the term Latino or Latinx in our research, we are counting people who are Latino or Hispanic, right? So if these numbers seem a little different than some other ways of counting things, there's, we kind of detail all of our methods and all of our reasons for that, but just something for you to note. So San Antonio already has a large people of color majority. We can see that, in fact, it has a Latino majority, 64% of the population. So when we dig into some of these other indicators and begin to see some of the inequities and outcomes, understanding the scale of exactly how many people we're talking about can be really important. So having a basis in thinking about who the people are, who the communities are, who ought to be the focus of different policy efforts can be a really important place to start. So for this indicator, as for all of our indicators, there are a few key things I want to point out. The first is this little question mark button here. If you're ever not sure what it is that you're looking at, or if you want to know kind of the technical definitions and the methodologies that we've used in this research, you can click here to get a quick definition of what the indicator is showing, or to go to our methods page. If you click on Learn More, that'll take you right to the methods for this indicator so that you can understand how we did these calculations. You will see the title so that you always know what place it is that you're looking at, what the indicator is, and the legend. And then there are different breakdowns that you can choose. So this is actually a menu that you can select from. We're starting with a trend, looking over time to see how things are changing. You can also look at this for raw population numbers. if you want to get a sense of the absolute numbers of people that we're talking about in those proportions. You can look at the population by age. So here we are, you get a sense of the age distribution of the city. And right now you can see that we're looking at all races and ethnicities, but maybe you want to see the age distribution just for Black residents, or compare that just for Latino residents. So for every breakdown that you choose, you'll see a different set of filters pop up. If you want to go back in time and say, how has the age distribution for a particular group changed over time? You can look at that as well historically. So there are, I'm sorry, I'm seeing that maybe folks are having trouble hearing me. Let me see if I can adjust that quickly before I go on. Is that better? Okay, hopefully that helps. If folks continue to have trouble hearing me, I'll see if I can find a better headset to use. So just want you to know that once you select a breakdown, there are lots of different ways to view the indicators. Then there are different filters that you can select to kind of get the right view that you want. Once you have a chart that looks the way you want it to, there are a few different ways that you can sort of port this out of the atlas to use for your own purposes. And that is this download button here will allow you to download an image that will include the chart and the heading, everything you need to know to understand what's being shown. You can download a PowerPoint deck that includes not just the chart that you've selected, but also some of the framing context that we provide around what this data shows and why it matters. Or if you're really ambitious, you can also download the raw data. If you want to kind of play with this and analyze it on your own or create a custom display, we also want to make sure that the data is available for you to use in whatever way best suits you. We're really sort of driven by the idea that democratizing this data is really essential to driving positive change in communities. And so this is a new feature just introduced last year that we've been able to offer these various kinds of access to the data underlying the display that you see here. So those are really exciting features. You can also share on social media if there's a story that you want to help amplify that some of our data can be helpful with. So this is kind of the basic feature of any indicator in the atlas. You'll see underneath that we always provide a summary of what this data is showing and why it matters. Again, we know that data is not the only way to understand things, and to help provide some interpretive direction for our audience or for your audience if you're using this data, whether kind of internally within your own work or externally in support of a campaign, that's a really essential piece. You'll also find related resources. So because here we're looking at race and ethnicity by age, you'll see that our report on bridging the racial generation gap comes up as a resource. So this is one of the ways that we have actually analyzed this data to understand how the generational gaps in diversity affect school spending, affect student outcomes. So that might be something you would want to check out. We know it's important to acknowledge the kind of systems and structures that give rise to inequities that we see. And so we are looking at the different drivers kind of behind the data. For most of our indicators, those are drivers of inequity here because we're just looking at demographics. We talk a little bit about the drivers of demographic shifts. And then we always want to include strategies and policy tools that are appropriate and related to the data that we're showing. So again, for every indicator, you're going to see this strategy section that links to different resources and examples of workable strategies and solutions to advance equity. So that's sort of the basic layout for any indicator in the atlas. And I know that we had talked about a few indicators that I think would be of interest to this group. So I want to show you our median wages, income inequality, and housing burden, but would also invite you all to take a look. And if there's something else here that you are particularly interested in, feel free to drop it in the chat or Q&A, and I'd be happy to walk through that as well. I'm going to start with median wages. And we are right in the middle of updating all the data in our database. So normally you wouldn't have to reselect every single time, but today we might have to do that. So just bear with me. All right, so here we're looking at median wages, which is important because in an equitable economy, all workers would earn a living wage without systematic differences by race and gender. Looking at this first chart, which just again shows us a trend over time for racial gaps in wages in San Antonio, we see that there are not only significant racial wage gaps, but that they've also grown over time. This is not something that's getting better. In 1980, we see a $5 gap between workers of color and white workers. In 2017, that's grown to a $7 gap because wages have remained basically stagnant for workers of color during that time. So we start here to give sort of the high level view of what's happening, a little bit of context, the lay of the land. But then again, the real power of the atlas and our disaggregation comes from this breakdown menu. So you'll see that the second option we have here is by race and ethnicity. We know that this people of color line in San Antonio is 75% of the population and very different. It's a very diverse population, right? So really understanding what the differences are between groups is going to be essential. So here what we're looking at are median wages by race and ethnicity for the 6 major racial ethnic groups in 2017. Again, because we've chosen this breakdown, there are different filters we can select from. We can go back in time to kind of get a comparative view of how these things have stacked up decade over decade. But you can begin to see with a little bit more specificity what some of the gaps and what some of the outcomes are. So it looks like Latinx workers earn the lowest median wages, $16 an hour. And because there's such a large share of the population, that's also the average for people of color overall. But also within that group, Asian or Pacific Islander workers actually earn the highest median wages in San Francisco, $25 an hour. So we're beginning to dig in a little bit more, disaggregate the data a little bit, try to understand where, what some of the driving forces might be behind this. You know your place better than I do, certainly, but this sort of immediately brings to mind issues around access to education, occupational segregation, and certainly bias and discrimination that still exist in the labor market, just sort of at a first glance here. So because of some of those questions, you can also break this down by educational level. So now we're looking both at race ethnicity, just as we were before, but now we're also looking at the educational attainment of workers. So you can see that for all groups, the more education you have, the higher median wages are, but racial gaps don't close, right? So we see here that education is not necessarily an equalizer. It looks like, for example, Black and Latinx workers with a 2-year college degree make just $1 more than white workers with only a high school diploma. So we know that there are other dynamics at play here. We can look at this data by race and gender together to try to understand the sort of intersection of racial and gender wage gaps. And here you see for each racial ethnic group, you have a gray bar that represents the median earnings of male workers and a teal bar that represents the median earnings of female workers. This is by virtue of the data sources that we use. We have this sort of binary gender in terms of the way that we can break the data down. So that's the best that we can offer because that's how the data is structured, but does reveal some pretty interesting things. You can see for some groups where the gender wage gap is smaller and some where it's significantly larger, and understanding sort of the composition of who's in the workforce and how gender plays into these outcomes that we see. We can compare by nativity, so understanding the different experiences of US born versus immigrant workers. And I want to point out another interesting feature here that you'll see, which is this compare button. So here we're looking at median wages by nativity in San Antonio. And so what do we see here? We see this gap between US born Latinx workers and immigrant Latinx workers, $17 versus $13 an hour. You might wonder, how does that compare to the state as a whole? Is that about the same? Is it better in San Antonio? Is it worse? So you can use the compare button that you see here to actually compare this to the state of Texas as a whole. Because we're already cutting in a lot of ways, the chart gets a little bit busy, but we can see that San Antonio is the orange bar here. So it looks like at the state level, median wages are a little bit higher for US born Latinx workers and a little lower for immigrant Latinx workers. So if, depending on what your particular focus is, this could be a really interesting lens, to frame a policy proposal or to help design a program that you might want to implement. So there are, I'm not sure what we'll get in San Antonio for Ancestry, but I want to show you what it looks like. Another feature that we added to the atlas after we launched it was this Ancestry Data, to understand the kind of differences within these large racial ethnic groups, which we know are also very diverse. And so if we wanted to, on the first chart that we looked at, we saw that the median wages for Asian or Pacific Islanders overall was $25 an hour. But we know that there are a lot of different experiences and a lot of different communities that are sort of grouped together in this category. So when we look by ancestry, we can see that median wages for Asian or Pacific Islanders, South Asian descent is $34 an hour, compared to just $17 an hour for those of Southeast Asian ancestry. So in bigger places, for example, if we were to look at this for the state of Texas as a whole, because the population is larger, we'll probably get some more groups here. So you can see that we have data available for many different ancestries to really help folks dig in to try to minimize the invisibility, of certain communities that happens when you present data in these aggregate categories. So that's just something else for you to be aware of. Again, at the city level, because we want to make sure we're always reporting data that's really robust and reliable, we have minimum thresholds, for what we'll report. And so that's why you saw fewer categories for San Antonio than for the state of Texas, but just to give you a sense of what it looks like. All right, so let's look at another indicator here. So we're looking a little bit at wages, which are reported obviously at the hourly level, and wanted to show you another indicator that is coming at this from a little bit different angle, which is our income inequality indicator. And so again, this gives you a quick sense of what you're looking at. It's household income at the 95th compared to the 20th percentile, which is a pretty common way of measuring income inequality. So what this shows is basically that 20% of all households, oops, sorry, let me go back to San Antonio. That's what we want to be looking at. All right, so 20% of households in San Antonio earn $20,400 or less. That's the household earnings at the 20th percentile. So 1 in 5 households are below this income level. At the 95th percentile, so looking at the top 5% of earners, average income is $181,000. So understanding the ratio between these things and how it's changing over time is one way to measure whether income inequality is shrinking or growing. So again, this is the most recent year of data that we have available in our database right now, which is 2017. Very shortly, that will be 2019, which is the most recent year available anywhere. So stay tuned for that update. But we've also looked at this historically. So we have years of comparison going back to 1980. So again, if we go to our breakdown menu, you'll see that there's a trend line that will show how that ratio is changing over time. A lower ratio means greater equality because we're taking that 95th percentile and dividing it by the 20th. So we can actually see that over time, income inequality has gotten worse in San Antonio. This chart also defaults to offering a comparison to the United States as a whole, just to give you a little bit of a benchmark of what the overall trend is in the nation and how your place compares. So it's been a little bit slower in the city of San Antonio, but also, still moving in the wrong direction. So again, if this is a data point that you want to dig in on, you can always check out our sort of summary statements on what it shows, why it matters, why it's happening, what are the drivers of this inequity, and what are the solutions that are being lifted up at different levels, of policy making to address these inequities. So this is one of the indicators that is, there isn't actually a way to break this down by race, that we're looking at this by income distribution, but within the context of understanding the demographics and the kind of household and worker level outcomes that people are experiencing. So there are a handful of indicators like that offer the kind of macroeconomic analysis, income inequality being one, job and wage growth being another, that you're not going to see disaggregated by race and ethnicity, but can be an important part of the context depending on exactly what your work is. So here we see the level of growth in jobs over the last few decades for low wage jobs, middle wage jobs, high wage jobs. This is really interesting. There are very few places in the country that this chart looks like this. Most of them you see sort of polarized growth in low wage and high wage jobs, and significantly lower growth in middle wage jobs. That's not the structure of how things have changed in San Antonio, but at the same time, you see that earnings have grown much more quickly for high wage workers. So this is part of that same story of growing income inequality. Since 1990, the wages of folks in low wage jobs has grown just 22% and 54% for high wage workers. So more than double. All right. Let's see. Housing burden. That's the next piece that I wanted to show. And again, feel free to let me know if there's an indicator you're particularly interested in. We should have time for that. Housing burden is one of, I think, our most viewed indicators. It's definitely one of the things that we have focused a lot of our research on, just understanding the depths of the housing affordability crisis all across the nation. That manifests differently from place to place, but there's really no place that isn't touched by it. We know that there's no state or major city in the country where minimum wage earners can afford an apartment, and according to the threshold of not paying more than 30% of their income for housing expenses. So we look at this quite a bit. So we define we use the definition of housing burden of spending more than 30% of your income on housing costs. So whether you're a renter or if you're a homeowner and that's the cost of your mortgage. And we use the term severely housing burdened if you spend more than 50% of your income on housing costs. So this is kind of a complicated indicator. There are a lot of different ways to look at it. So again, we start with sort of the simplest display. Let's understand the major racial equity trends in housing burden, looking at the share of people of color who are burdened over time compared to the share of white people who are burdened over time. When we look at this chart, we can see that for both of these groups, that number has increased in recent decades, particularly dramatically since 2000. If we look at population growth in the city and we look at the cost of housing, I'm sure there are a lot of different ways to make sense of this, but at no point do we see the racial inequities sort of going away or being eliminated. So this gives us, again, the kind of sense of what's happening at a high level. Here we are looking at renters. And again, if you're not sure what the chart is showing, this technical title will always tell you. Maybe, if you're doing work around home ownership and you want to understand the housing burden of homeowners, you can filter this to look at owners instead of renters. It gives you a little bit different sense. Or maybe you want to look at renters who are severely burdened, those again who are paying 50% or more of their income on housing costs. And so there's always, any given indicator. There are probably dozens of ways to configure the charts when you select a breakdown and then look through the filters. So for us and for our perspective today, looking at the kind of racial element and dimension of this can be really important. So here we're looking at the major racial ethnic groups, the share who are housing burdened, and we see that the highest rates are among Black and Latinx renters. About half of all households, Black and Latinx households in San Antonio are burdened by rent costs. The lowest rate is in the Asian or Pacific Islanders, about 37%. So this, will give you a little bit of a sense of where some of those racial disparities are. And again, you can look at lots of different things here. You can compare renters to owners. You can change the severity. You can also look at the share of households who are burdened by poverty status. So we know that different multiples of the federal poverty level are often used to determine eligibility for certain programs, right? So you have to have income below 133% or below 150% of the federal poverty level. So we also offer this breakdown by household income. We at PolicyLink use 200% of the federal poverty level as a bare minimum for economic security. We know that the poverty threshold is so low, so inadequate for what it actually costs for a basic household budget. So we would call anyone under below 200% of poverty economically insecure. When you look just at that population, you can see that these rates of housing burden really sort of skyrocket. Overall, you have almost 80%, almost 4 out of 5 households are housing burdened. So this gives you a sense not just of the overall scope and scale of this challenge in San Antonio, but also who is really bearing that burden. And we see that it is largely Black and Latinx families, and basically everyone who's economically insecure is really feeling this. I probably am not going to click through all of the different breakdowns because I showed you what they looked like on the median wage. But again, you can compare this by gender, by nativity, ancestry. And this is another, let's go back to all income levels. This is another way to compare rather than just selecting a specific place. So I just realized that we're looking at the region of San Antonio. Sorry, y'all. It's tricky when the region and the city have the same name in our database because usually the region has a longer name and that gives you a clue. That didn't change the numbers too much, which isn't surprising. But in addition to comparing to one other specific geography, you might also wonder, how does San Antonio stack up to other large cities? Is this, are we sort of on par with other places? Is it better or worse here? And so you'll see that this indicator has a ranking breakdown that's going to compare San Antonio to the other largest 100 cities in the US. It looks like it's right in the middle. So we have data available for 83 out of those 100 cities, and San Antonio is ranked number 49. That is for all renters, all races and ethnicities who are rent burdened. You might wonder, okay, but we had higher rates of rent burden for Black and Latinx families. I wonder how we compare just for those groups. So you can filter this to get a ranking for housing burden just for Black renters. You see that San Antonio is actually closer to the bottom of that list. 53% is high, but when we look at the places where it's the highest in the country, Stockton, California, just up the street from me, is ranked number 1 at 70% for all Black renter households. So you could compare, you could find the numbers for peer cities in Texas if you wanted to do that. There's a lot of different ways to sort of use this data. And again, you could say, well, where did we rank in 2000? It hasn't been much change. Or where do we rank, for homeowners who are spending too much on rent? That's going to make me reselect. So you can see that there are a lot of different ways to kind of chop up this data. And then one other thing I'll show you, and then I promise I'll take a breath and see if there are any questions or issues you all want to discuss. This is really closely related to one of those economic benefits of equity indicators that I told you about. So now that we have a sense of the scale of rent burden in San Antonio, where you see that overall half of all renter households are spending more than 30% of their income on rent, we know that that directly inhibits their ability to pay for other basic needs. When we think about the cost of childcare, which is going up, the cost of transportation, particularly as people are displaced, from centers of opportunity, and then they have longer commutes, or they have higher transportation costs to get to work, to get to school, to get to childcare. We know that this is a tremendous economic burden on families and on households. And so we wanted to calculate, we wanted to give some sense of what the benefits would be of eliminating that rent burden. If no households paid more than 30% of their income for rent, what would the benefits be? And so you can see that in the city of San Antonio alone, this is a pretty massive sum. In 2017, it would have added about $567 million into the households of families in your city. So when we think about the share of a grocery budget, or the share of college tuition, or lots of other ways that people could spend their money saving for retirement, when we think particularly in the context of COVID and the number of families who are now behind on rent, right? Who not only were paying too much to begin with, but now have accumulated rent debt or utility debt. Really figuring out how to address this affordability crisis is, again, not just a moral issue. This is about sort of the economic vitality of the region and the other ways that this money could be circulating and growing. We look at this over time, and it's the economic impacts of rent burden have increased dramatically. So basically doubling since 2000, when it was about $285 million difference. So if we want to, we start here by looking at the total. We can look at a trend line. We can also look at the average gains when we think about the impact that would have on household budgets, who's going to benefit and how much, right? And so we can see here for different racial ethnic groups exactly what the impact would be. The yellow bar shows the average disposable income that those families have now with the current levels of rent burden, and the green bar shows what their average disposable income would be if we eliminated rent burden. So you can get a sense pretty clearly of the difference, between those two numbers. And when you think about how much difference an extra $5,000, $6,000 a year could make for rent burden families, it's pretty significant. So this is one of our newer indicators, and we have begun to understand exactly how important this is. We have a new report that's getting ready to come out that I'll give you a little bit of a scoop on, where we calculated the number of zip codes in the 150 largest metro regions that were available to earners at the median income by race and ethnicity. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that across those large metro areas, just 7% of zip codes are affordable to Black families at the median income. That was pretty shocking. So we a couple of years ago had done an analysis of affordability in San Francisco, where I'm located, which is, has the highest rents of anywhere in the country, sometimes occasionally the highest rents anywhere in the world, and found that 5% of our zip codes were affordable to households with 2 minimum wage earners. That's a really tiny fraction, right? But it didn't seem all that surprising, because this is sort of the epicenter or the poster child of the housing affordability crisis. But to understand that across the country, across the 150 largest regions, it's the same level of crisis for Black renter households. And so this is for us, a really important tool to give to advocates to be able to quantify, not only to qualify, but to quantify how much this issue matters. So again, you can look at, there are lots of different ways to compare this. We see that disposable income would increase by about 50% across all renters, with some differences for different races and ethnicities. You can get a sense of, again, how San Antonio compares to other cities in terms of what that gain would be. So lots of different ways to dig in. We probably could have spent this whole 90 minutes just on one indicator, kind of going through all of the different options that exist. But I'm hoping that you'll be interested enough to want to explore on your own and dig in a little bit more to the things that are of interest to you. So I'm going to pause there. Would love to, if my colleagues want to share either at the city or from the Atlas team, if there are any questions that have come up, or we can just kind of open it up to some discussion.
Abby, there are some questions. Someone asked if you can take a look at the life expectancy indicator.
Sure, happy to. So life expectancy is also a relatively new indicator for the Atlas. And you'll notice here that I'm not able to select the city. So some of our indicators, because of the way the data is structured, the region is the smallest geography that we'll be able to look at. So I will look at the region here to show you what this looks like. And again, we sort of start with a trend line going back to 2005. Here we aren't seeing a whole lot of change, although it is interesting to see that life expectancy for Black residents in the San Antonio region has increased from 73 to 76. It looks like no change for white residents and a slight increase for Latinx residents. We see this sort of lone dot here for Asian or Pacific Islanders, and that means that we didn't have enough data to reliably report for the other years yet. So, but we want to make available the data that we do have. So once we refresh this data set, it could be that, for 2019, there will be another green dot over here, even if we couldn't show the intervening years. So this is going to show you, again, the trends over time. You can look at this by race ethnicity as well. And if the trend wasn't clear enough, maybe, you would want to compare just two different points in time to get a little bit better sense and a little more legible idea of what the racial gaps look like here. So here we've filtered to 2005, and then 2016 is the more recent year. Again, you can look at the ranking for different regions, and you'll be able to do this for either all racial ethnic groups, which is what we're looking at now, the sort of overall average, or you can pick for a specific group. So we can see that of the 150 largest regions, San Antonio has the 41st highest life expectancy for Black residents in 2016. We noted from an earlier chart that was an improvement over 2005. So I would be curious to see if other places have seen a similar improvement, or if, in which case the ranking would be about the same, or if San Antonio has improved more than other places. Looks like the ranking didn't change a whole lot. So it may be that there's an overall or a larger trend across different regions for that increase as well. So those are the different ways that we can look at life expectancy. We'll see if this. So this is another interesting feature. Many of our indicators have this mapping feature, so that you can get a sense of kind of the geographic differences, within a given region or within a state here. So this gives us a county level map looking at Texas, where we can see, some spots where the life expectancy is significantly lower, sometimes in neighboring counties. in Webb County, 79 years, Duval County, 73. So again, sort of coming back to that notion of how much place matters and the intersection of race and place in some of the outcomes that we see here. Again, for life expectancy, if you scroll down the page, you'll see some of the reports that we have done that relate specifically to health equity, of which life expectancy is obviously sort of a key indicator, looking at the drivers of inequity. Why do we see the gaps that we do in life expectancy between different racial ethnic groups? And what can we do about it, right? What are the strategies that can be put forward by cities or by states, or even at the neighborhood level, to sort of mitigate some of these things?
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abby. Oh my God.
Yeah, this is hard. I just wanted to point out, Abby, I think there was a question that came in about what can we do? And I think the person asking is asking a we, I'm going to say they're asking as a universal collective we of all of us, do to help create a system level change for further disaggregating data. And this question came in before you showed the breakdown of some of what we have available in the Atlas for breaking down the API data, which is a great example, and just thought, this question seemed to talk to what can we do to continue to push for more of that type of data to be available.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think it's really has become such a hot button issue because of some of the federal policies that we experienced under the last administration related to census data collection that are still being grappled with by this administration. Although we know that as part of the racial equity executive order, there is a concerted effort and a lot of attention being paid at the federal level to what kinds of data disaggregation we need, because the sources like the National Equity Atlas really rely on that federal data in order to provide the level of disaggregation that we do. That's a key step. And there are a lot of organizations and individuals who are really advocating and working tirelessly to try to improve the quality of the data that we have available. What kinds of questions are asked and of whom and how often, so that we can get that into the hands of decision makers, of policymakers, of equity leaders. So that's one piece of it. The other piece, I think, really comes from the bottom up. We hope that the Atlas is useful, and I think we have examples of it being really useful at the local level, but we also know that part of its power is the comparison that it can offer, being able to provide data for the 301 different geographies that we do. And before the end of this year, that's probably going to be 700 geographies, because we're starting to add in county level data as well. But we know that there's a lot of data collection that happens at the local level that's much richer than anything we're ever going to be able to provide, because we rely on these big data sets that we can draw from multiple places at once. So when we think about program completion data in workforce development, or we think about how can you make longitudinal tracking systems for education and employment outcomes speak to data systems, that cities or counties use on who is who's accessing certain kinds of services, right, related to housing or childcare or different systems that folks are navigating that are often disconnected. Their data systems don't talk to each other. They don't collect data on demographics that would allow us to meaningfully disaggregate. So I think there's both the kind of top-down approach, of data advocacy that happens largely at the federal level, certainly some at the state level. And then there's the ground-up approach of cities and communities and service providers, making the most of the data that they collect to understand their own outcomes, to kind of track and course correct on their strategies.
Thank you. And that actually tees up, I think, for the next question, which is more of the technical side, but how often we update the data. And Is it only new data coming in that is updated, or is past data updated if we find new information?
Great question. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute, but I can go back to that if somebody wants to look at something. Feels a little more conversational this way. So we say that our data is updated about annually. We rely again on the American Community Survey and the micro data that allows us to kind of do the crosscuts that are required for our disaggregation. Is also updated roughly annually, but it's not necessarily always at the same time. And we also have occasionally the additional challenge of needing to make sure that we are always comparing the same geography, that we're using geographies that are consistent over time. Before I worked on this project, it would never have occurred to me how often some of those geographic boundaries can change in the way that different places are defined. And so we definitely update with new data about once a year. And there's a kind of multi-step process of making sure that everything aligns properly with the place and with the population. So I think that's the past data is sort of a proofing for that. Certainly if we add a new indicator, because this is definitely, it's a living resource, right? The indicators we have now are not the same indicators you would have seen a few years ago, because we used to have some data sources that aren't available anymore. And so we had to let go of those indicators. We've added new indicators. We're planning to add more in the future. So if we add a new indicator, we certainly would go back and reconstruct previous points in time for that as well, because part of our goal is to be able to measure and track progress over time. So we would definitely do some of that backfilling in that case.
Thank you. Another question that came in was, I think, asking for perhaps an example of how and when this tool has been used that has made an impact, I think, to change an initiative versus if it wasn't used. I think it's asking for an example.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I'm going to point you to the impact section on our website, which is under Data in Action, that will have some of these stories that you can take a look at, the way that different groups have used our data. I'm also happy to tell you quickly a couple of examples. One is in the county and school district of Fairfax County, Virginia. We did an equity profile that was basically a deep dive into all of the available data from the Atlas on Fairfax County as sort of a baseline report for the county government and the school board. And based on the data insights and based on the recommendations that we put forward in that report, they actually passed what they call a One Fairfax policy for both the county and the school board that is requires a racial equity assessment, like racial equity in all policies that are passed at the county level or by the school board. So it wasn't necessarily one specific initiative, but it really motivated the county government and really equipped equity leaders to push on them to say, we need to embed racial equity and this lens in everything that we do. Fairfax County is one of the wealthiest counties in the country. So when you look at aggregate measures, the economy is really strong, educational outcomes are really great. And so that masked a lot of very, very deeply entrenched racial inequities. And so our report and being able to kind of draw some of those insights out helped advocates to be able to push for that policy. And then a more recent example is closer to home for me here in Contra Costa County in the San Francisco Bay Area. We used Atlas data and our analysis of the impacts of COVID, the sort of economic and health impacts of COVID, to support equity campaign leaders who wanted to extend an eviction moratorium that was getting ready to expire, to protect vulnerable renters who were behind on rent, but also had lost employment income. And, we're still facing sort of the greatest health risks of the pandemic, as well as as helping the county decide to put about $1.5 million, I think, to funding overdue utility bills. So we did an analysis of who owed water debt in California and found that Contra Costa County was one of the places where that debt was most concentrated. So we, produced this data in partnership with local organizations who were sort of lobbying the Board of Supervisors to make those calls. And I want to show you really quickly, because I didn't get to this. We talked a little bit, or you saw in the video a little bit, about the Racial Equity Data Lab, which is this newest project on the Atlas that my colleague Selena leads. That's really about helping folks to develop their own visualizations of Atlas data. We, as you saw, we put together 1 million different charts, but there are 1 million more that you could make. And so we really wanted to make the data as accessible as possible to folks. So in partnership with Tableau, we've created this space where you can access Atlas data that's sort of ready to plug in to the Tableau visualization software to kind of make your own fact sheets or dashboards. And we've made a few of them ourselves as well. And one of them, let's go to the gallery here. One of them is this rent debt dashboard that's talking exactly about that data I just mentioned. We rely for this on the Household Pulse Survey. So it's not available for all the same geographies that are in the Atlas, but we do have almost all states and then 15 large metro areas. San Antonio is not one of them, but we can look at the county level because we have data for Texas. So this shows that in Texas, there are about 750,000 households who are behind on rent. The percentage of that going from 14% in last summer, about a year ago, in the earlier months of the pandemic, it's now at about 21%. And those 750,000 households owe about $2.2 billion in back rent. So we know that this is a big problem. We know that it's directly related to the pandemic when we compare what the numbers were before to what they are now. And we can get a sense, let's see how adept I'll be at this. Bexar County, right? 52,000 households have rent debt. If we want to see what the total debt is in your county, $150 million, which means, where are you? Estimated rent debt per household of about $2,800 in rent arrears. So when we look at the overall economic impact of this rent debt, when we look at who's impacted, 84% of those renters with debt in Texas are people of color. Almost all of them are low income. Most have lost unemployment income during the pandemic and even in the last month. So again, we bring in here our data on rent debt to understand the share of households by race who are, both rent burdened and economically insecure, and looking at, how are people getting by? How are folks making ends meet, during this crisis in terms of taking on additional debt or relying on family. So this is another way that, apart from the kind of longer term indicator data in the Atlas, we want to bring, any data that's available that we know is going to really help to advance equity on the ground. We want to make it as available as possible. So I think this is another way that we've seen some pretty significant impact from our data. Most recently, Seattle also extended its eviction moratorium and cited the data from this dashboard in that policy decision as well. While we're here, before we queue up another question, there's one other piece of our gallery that I want to show you, which is this Black prosperity in America. So this dashboard is going to have data available for all of the Atlas geographies because it's relying specifically on Atlas data. And when we looked at the median wage indicator before, I showed you that we could break it down by race, ethnicity, we can add a gender element, a nativity element. You can look at it by educational attainment to see the impacts of higher education. But it's going to be comparing all racial ethnic groups all the time, right? That's sort of the way that our data is structured. And so we built this dashboard to specifically understand Black-white income gaps. There is not great data on the racial wealth gap, and we know that income and wealth are not the same thing. But to be able to contribute a little bit to that ongoing conversation and debate, we wanted to pull together Atlas data and visualize it in a different way that would really sort of shine a light on Black-white income gaps. And I'm going to give it just one more minute to see if it'll load. And if not, then I'll just sort of send out the link so you can check it out on your own time. But this was an interesting exercise for us because we wanted to be able to understand and quantify and kind of show the specific trends in these for wages for Black workers. So here we're looking at San Antonio, and we start with higher education because we know this is an important piece when we dig in a little bit more to the data, and can see that the share of adults with a four-year college degree, Black adults, has increased over time from 19% in 2000 to 25% in 2017. It's actually increased a little bit faster than educational attainment for white workers. So you would think that might have a positive impact on sort of closing the wage gaps during that same time. And this is going to go real slow, so I'll just tell you what it does that's different. In addition to showing you the sort of absolute wages for different points in time, these displays are also going to tell you the ratio. So what's the dollar earnings gap between Black and white workers, and also what is the ratio of earnings. And when I was looking at this data earlier this morning, it shows that for San Antonio, the racial wage gap has actually grown pretty significantly over the last 20 years. I think in 2000, and don't quote me on these numbers, but you can come back and double check them. I think Black workers on average, Black college graduates on average earned 83 cents for every dollar earned by their white counterparts. And that had fallen to like 78 cents per dollar. And that is among college graduates. So understanding the impact of education, but also these sort of other dynamics that people are contending with. And as always with new technologies and more flexible technologies, sometimes we have these little technical glitches, but you should definitely check out the lab and these dashboards. Pretty cool. We have time for another question or two if there are any other outstanding.
Thanks, Abby. The next question up comes from Connie, and she's asking, are the various industries or sectors for types of jobs or work available contributed to the data collected for wages?
That's a great question. So there is data available that's not necessarily in the Atlas yet. We do have some data on wages, not only by industry, but also by occupation. So digging down to a pretty fine grain, occupational codes. That is part of adding those kinds of indicators to the Atlas is part of our wish list for the next couple of years. There are a range of about 6 kind of workforce and industry related indicators that we would like to add, including some that look at job quality, automation resilience, and sort of job stability at the occupational and industrial level, so that we can really bring to light some of these issues around occupational segregation and those wage differences that are kind of driving some of the higher level outcomes that we see. So I'm glad to hear if that's of interest to you, because it's certainly something that we're hoping to build in.
Thanks, Abby. And I think one other key question that's an interesting one, perhaps not specific data question, or it's a data question as well, but how does gentrification of a region and out-of-state people moving to cheaper areas affect the affordable housing crisis, and perhaps the numbers that were presented in the Atlas graphs?
Yeah, it's a good question. We know that it's a super complex issue, right? When we look at the relationship even just between how the housing market prices and what that does to median rents in an area, or when you look at places that have large influx of like in movers from other regions, when there is economic growth and the sort of attendant population growth that comes with that, how that impacts local housing markets. We do have data that shows, and plenty of anecdotes as well, that as rent rises in a gentrifying area within a region, it tends to push rents up, in sort of concentric circles outward. So there are, oftentimes you'll see sort of multiplying waves of displacement that people face from, when there aren't any policy controls in place around just cause eviction or around rent control, or sort of other measures that can help to protect vulnerable renters. You will see massive rent increases in a gentrifying area that displace people maybe just to the outer rings of a center city, out into the suburbs, sometimes out of the region altogether. That's definitely the story that we've seen here in the Bay Area. San Francisco being really the hottest part of the market, and the pressure that has put on surrounding cities and surrounding suburbs. We've done an analysis that shows that Oakland, just across the water, lost nearly 30% of its Black population in the span of just 10 years. And we know that housing costs are not the only reason for that, but it certainly is a central driver. And so thinking about all of the different mechanisms that impact that, there are issues around affordable housing production, and affordable housing preservation, and zoning laws, and just really sort of overdetermined kind of crisis that folks are facing. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question.
Yeah, I think another question that's a little bit of a forward-looking one is asking, do we expect any data or indicators regarding health inequities in comparison by race and ethnicity in the near future?
That's a great question. We used to have more. We used to have indicators on asthma and obesity, and Michelle, I'm blanking on the third. You can pop in. So we used to have a few health specific indicators. And the problem was that the data source that we use for those was sort of discontinued. So there are all kinds of federal data sources that will be, kind of continuously updated and collected for 20 or 16 and a half, I don't know, like random amounts of time, number of years. And then they just stopped collecting them, which meant that we were no longer able to update the data. And we kept it for a while, kind of hoping that they were going to refresh those data sets and that we would be able to provide new data. But once it's sort of discontinued, it's no longer relevant, right? If the newest data that we could offer was 2011, that's not going to be particularly useful to people. So we are always on the lookout, and definitely understand the importance and would love to be able to include more health indicators. So it's sort of a moving target for us in terms of what we're able to add and what we would like to add. So I think the answer is hopefully, but we can't commit to anything just yet. And I think maybe we'll stop there, and I will turn it over to Jonathan, since we're closing in on the end of our time together. Thank you all so much. I will put my email in the chat. And also happy to send a follow-up. We are recording this webinar, so you'll have access to that. And I would be happy to answer any additional questions if something is burning that we didn't get to or something occurs to you once we're done. Please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Abby. This has been amazing. So thank you so much. On behalf of the Office of Equity, I want to extend our gratitude to the amazing team at PolicyLink, Abby Langston, Selena Tan, Michelle Huang, and Jennifer Gardner for providing us a great overview of the National Equity Atlas, which is such an important resource for us as city employees and really using disparity data to drive policy and budgetary decision-making at a local level. You know, in our work, we often ask departments to think about which populations are the worst off, with the understanding that if we meet the needs of populations experiencing the worst disparities, we can begin to improve outcomes for all residents. And the National Equity Atlas in a lot of ways helps us to identify those key racial, economic, and gender disparities and the deeply entrenched inequities in San Antonio we want to address to achieve a more equitable future for the city. Before we close out, as part of our ongoing effort to normalize conversations of racial equity in government, I would like to briefly announce that our next Lunch and Learn webinar will focus on addressing the increasing discrimination and incidents of racial violence experienced by Asian American and Pacific Islander communities nationally. The Stop API Hate webinar will be on Wednesday, July 21st from 11:30 to 1 p.m. So please keep an eye out for more details that will be in our July COSA e-newsletter, or feel free to send us an email if you're interested in participating and we'll send you a meeting invitation. And lastly, we want to thank you all for spending your lunch with us. We look forward to seeing you again, albeit virtually in the near future. Take care, everyone, and thank you again for joining us.